Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar, Beyond the Nigerian Prince, the Evolution of Phishing and How We Fight Against It. I'm Rita Baugh, I'm the Vice President of Marketing for GreatHorn, and I'm pleased to have you join us today for our webinar. A few housekeeping items just before we begin. You will be on mute during the duration of the webinar, but you have the opportunity to submit questions at any time through the GoToWebinar control panel. That section is probably on your right in the panel itself. Feel free to enter something in. We will try to get to all the questions at the end of the webinar. We're planning to have the webinar take about 40, maybe 45 minutes, depending on how many questions that we get, but certainly feel free to join us at any time. We will have recording, we will have the webinar recorded and make it available for replay for all those who have joined, as well as slides. I'm joined today by Kevin O'Brien, CEO of GreatHorn, and Tim Dragan, CEO of dmarcian. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the webinar. Kevin, first to you.
Thanks, Sarita. Nice to be here. Kevin O'Brien, CEO and co-founder at GreatHorn. Looking forward to the conversation. A little bit of brief biographical information. I'm a serial entrepreneur in the cybersecurity space. I've been doing this for about 20 years. And we'll be talking today about the evolution of email security threat. I'm really excited to be joined by Tim. Tim, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
All right, thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Dragan, CEO of dmarcian. Hey, thanks very much for taking time to listen in today. Today is a special day, as this webinar is the first collaboration between GreatHorn and dmarcian. The two companies both participate in the email industry, but in very different ways. And so partnering together and comparing notes has already led to some really great insight. And sharing this on this webinar makes today special for me and hopefully for you. Okay, next slide. I get the honor of kicking us off today. This is myself. This is a picture of myself as a baby looking into the crystal ball of my future. I had no idea back then that I'd be, excuse me, that I'd end up spending so much time working on email. I like to think that the baby isn't on the verge of crying, but instead is expressing a look of awe. Yeah, that's what I like to think, at least. I'm a software engineer by trade. I spent the first 30-something years of my life in Silicon Valley trying to work on the most difficult technology problems that I could find. When my wife and I decided to slow down and start a family, I naturally took a job at an email company because, as we all know, there really isn't much to email. This was back in the early 2000s. It's supposed to be a joke. During a Friday afternoon beer bash way back when, I was pulled aside by a VP to get my thoughts on the company's plans to make the best anti-spam filter in the world. Back then, the company had a super fast platform for sending email, but the company needed, because the company needed a plan to break into the enterprise. At that time, people were just starting to realize the importance of security. So why not tap into this enterprise security market with an anti-spam solution? Easy money. Let's see here. At the time, I made an off-the-cuff remark along the lines of, we'll make a lot of money, but it won't solve the problem. The problem back then, as I saw it, was one of basic email identity. People can't easily tell if a piece of email is real or not. That off-the-cuff remark kicked off my own involvement in a huge cross-industry effort that finally resulted in the public release of the DMARC technical specification around 2012. Since then, I've been doing everything I can to get the world to adopt DMARC. But today's webinar is not all about DMARC. Next slide, please. What I still struggle with today is the size and the scope of email in today's world. Everyone uses email all the time, everywhere. It's still just mind-bogglingly large. The scale of email, I believe, puts it at the same level as a utility like water and electricity. But what makes email complicated is that it isn't a single thing. It's better thought of as a giant pile of technical specifications that describe how all the pieces can interoperate together. In my opinion, what makes email beautiful is that anyone can make their own version of the pieces and play it together with the existing ecosystem. The end result is the world's largest online communication medium, and it's wholly owned by no one, which I think makes it worth working on. I have to think like this, or else I probably would have gone insane a long time ago. All right, so with all this background out of the way, thanks for sticking with it. We can get to the point of this webinar. Why is phishing still a problem, and what could be done about it? To answer this question, have to consider the larger context. As the internet continues to evolve and create opportunities for people, criminals, they also evolve to take advantage of new opportunities. If email is viewed as an ecosystem with lots of pieces of all interoperating with each other and not as a monolithic thing, hopefully it starts to become clear that the pieces themselves evolve at different rates, and that there are industries in place that focus on specific pieces. So due to this kind of piecemeal evolution, email has seen significant investment over the past couple of decades. An analyst piece from, I think, 5 years ago or so put the annual spend on anti-spam technology somewhere between $7 and $10 billion a year. And that's just for the technology dedicated to blocking spam. And that's dated information. But despite this massive and continued investment in email security, certain threats continue to sail through existing email security solutions. And I really want to jump ahead, but I'm not. So before we ask, how can this be? We'll take a look at what the threats look like. And Kevin, you're on the front lines of this. So for the next slide, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tim. It's a good story. And since you broached the idea of analysts and their input on this, allow me to quote from one of my favorite analysts who work on the space. In a presentation they gave in a ballroom in a hotel somewhere, they said, email is one of the few enterprise systems that can truly be defined as venerable, yet utterly vulnerable. And I think that's a really salient point for the conversation we're having today, because email is nearly 47 years old, and yet it still has some of the largest impact on the overall cybersecurity industry, and by extension, on the organizations for whom those cybersecurity impacts have the most direct bottom line consequences. And yet, if you ask the average organizational user of email, as we did back over the summer, we took a survey of approximately 300 professionals, split roughly 50-50 between information security professionals and non-information security professionals. Most people say the biggest problem we have is spam. That's an intriguing misunderstanding, because it's not one that's mirrored on the InfoSec side. If you survey, and you see it here on the slide, the left-hand column, the organizational users responsible for thinking about cybersecurity, most of them say, we understand that there is a continuum of threat that we receive over the communication medium of email, ranging from phishing to targeted phishing, from direct financial requests that are from fraudulent senders through to malware distribution, so-called payload attacks. Moreover, 20% of the time, those attacks are bypassing all of the legacy security solutions that these organizations have put in place, meaning that a remediation step is needed. In the InfoSec world, we think about two key metrics: time to detection, how long does it take you to find out that something bad is happening, and time to response, how long does it take you to go deal with that problem. Email is ubiquitous. Every professional has it, and 100% of surveyed professionals open all of their work email. They may not respond to it or do something with it, but you can guarantee that you can get to somebody by sending them an email in a professional context. The right-hand column here, though, points out that the layperson, that is the non-InfoSec professional, generally speaking, categorizes all of the, quote, bad email they get as spam. And so we have this really intriguing moment that has started to happen in the InfoSec industry, where we've recognized that email is in fact this primary threat vector. And yet we still have this misunderstanding by most of the people who are directly affected by that, that they are solving a spam problem. Over the course of the rest of our time today, we're going to talk in some detail about what that really looks like, why spam is only part of the problem, and how you can begin to think about creating an InfoSec response that has some nuance to it and can respond to the real threats you get. But I want to put some context around that first. And that is that this is not a tech problem. You have two CEOs of two tech companies presenting to you, but this isn't a product pitch. And you can't solve the email security problem or the phishing problem simply by putting tech in place or buying something. Instead, there's a continuum here. And that continuum ranges from industry level controls, some of which we'll cover, to organizational process, to individual responsibility and context. And having a response plan that runs the gamut from the industry to the individual is an essential part of how we start to solve for this email problem. Before we get there, I want to turn it over to Tim, given the background that he shared. Tim, you've been in the trenches, you've seen this evolution of threat. As we think through this idea of this continuum of response, can you take us through the history of what the problem has been and where we are today and how we got here?
Yes, I can. But before we go there, I just wanted to add a sidebar. While collaborating on this webinar, GreatHorn, dmarcian, we wanted to put together a clear picture of how to think about email security in today's modern world. Doing so, it became clear that an effective response to phishing has to include more than just technology, as Kevin just said. The effective response has to look at the different actors at play. There are individuals within organizations. There are organizations that coexist on the open internet, represented on the previous slide as the industry. Traditionally, security people use the concept of defense in depth, and they apply the concept largely to things that fall into the realm of the organization. Firewalls, gateways, packet inspection, logging, event analysis. By broadening the perspective and looking at the relationship between individuals and organizations, between organizations and their industries, we were able to put together a pretty clear picture on how to think about email security in a way that addresses today's advanced threats. We can't get very far, though, unless we look at how the risk has evolved alongside the internet. And that brings us to the guy coming out of the envelope right in the middle of the slide there. What we call email security and how we manage the risk around it today, it really started off as something different. Way back when, people ran email servers on real hardware in a closet or under someone's desk, believe it or not. The people doing so were largely known as sysadmins. These were the smart people keeping all the machines running. They were largely viewed as people that shunned daylight and spoke in riddles, also known as best friends. At that time, spam and unwanted email was largely viewed as a nuisance. There were some commercial offerings at the time, but those were mostly sold to people that did not have a sysadmin. I think that's represented by the frayed cables in the IT closet there. But what happened was, over time, nuisance email, it evolved to be operated by professional spammers, and their job was, and the job of dealing with all the crap email that they sent fell to dedicated IT professionals within the company. Instead of being a nuisance, the amount of spam received, it became a detriment to business operations. And when viewed as an impediment to business, budgets became available, and the commercial anti-spam industry basically took off. In managing crap email, it was a problem that could be solved by purchasing a filter that scrubs stuff as it flowed into your network. But at some point, the professional spammers realized that the technology and the operational expertise that they developed while spamming, they could also use it in a different way. Not to send stock scam or sex pill email, but instead to deliver email to people with an intention to deceive. And it was then that the economic driver behind email security risk, it changed from using email as an inexpensive marketing channel to using email as a way to expose huge numbers of people to con jobs at basically no cost to the criminal. This is sort of how crap email went from being a nuisance to becoming weaponized. But to really understand why today's situation is bad, we have to look at what technology has been doing for us. And that should bring us to the next slide, which is way back when. Most anti-spam technology was developed to block waves of spam, as you can see here, 4 of them. The waves are different, and they happen at different times. But if you look closely, you can start to see patterns. Next slide, please. The anti-spam technology that was developed largely works by collecting huge amounts of spam, collecting huge amounts of not spam, also known as ham, and then using machine learning techniques to identify patterns that match only against spam. Those patterns, they're then productized, and they're used to block these waves of spam as they slosh around the internet. And the better you do, the more money you can make. But when spammers realize that using email to deceive could be far more lucrative than selling sex pills to a few suckers, the anti-spam technologies still had a role to play. GreatHorn had a great phrase for this that I'm going to adopt. They called it volumetric phishing. That's the next slide. Yeah, thank you. This is where anti-spam technology really starts to break down. The bad actors, they continue to evolve beyond this defense. These are some samples. Kevin, I'm not sure if you wanted to talk to this slide or not.
Yeah, I think when we talk about volumetric phishing, one of the things we see is that we have all received messages like this to our personal addresses. If you've had email, you've seen this. And it's become a cultural joke based on how prevalent it was. The Nigerian prince, the title of the webinar itself, comes from a particularly virulent strand of this particular kind of phishing. But we saw this start to also move into the corporate world, and you still see this. The dates on these emails are real. These are real screenshots, and these are coming to real professionals from our customer set, or in some cases our own organizations. And now I think we can lay claim to the fact that we've gotten pretty good at volumetric phishing detection. You can also see that a lot of these are in junk folders. And that's because this problem, to Tim's earlier point, has now had almost 20 years of spam and ham collection to block what is coming in that's unwanted when it's something that looks very much like one of these messages. Of course, that's not the whole problem. Back over to you, Tim.
Yeah, next slide. So this is the big if there's only one bad email and you can't collect samples about it, you can't write rules, and the badness has a chance of getting in front of a human. This kind of small batch, call it artisanal phishing, people refer to as spearfishing. But it's one thing to cast a wide net to try to defraud a bunch of people at once, as volumetric phishing does. But when the focus is on tricking a specific individual to do something that they shouldn't, that's a special category of phishing, hence the spearfishing moniker. It's become the norm, though, so people call this type of attack just phishing now instead of calling it spearfishing. But Kevin sees a lot more of these samples than I do at dmarcian, and that should be the next slide, our samples.
So when I first started GreatHorn, and our initial iteration of the company was to look only at spearfishing and focus on that one aspect of email security. We do more now, but that was the starting point. I was in New York City, and I was presenting to a room full of people about this problem. And 4.5 years ago, spearfishing was still the term that was used in the industry to describe the challenge. And I remember that the venture capitalist whom I was speaking to listened politely to me for a few moments and then scrunched her face up and asked me how we were starting a technology company that had anything to do with the maritime trade. It was obviously a misunderstanding, and I knew then that probably wasn't the investor for us. At least we hadn't impressed her sufficiently to get her to want to invest in what she thought we were doing. But the reality was that the term was one that everyone had seen. They just didn't know it. And think back to the survey we put up at the beginning of this presentation, there is still a misunderstanding and misdifferentiation between spam and spearfishing. So what is it? Let's clear it up. Targeted phishing, targeted attacks, spearfishing, they represent an attack where somebody impersonates typically an executive in a company over email through a variety of exploitation techniques to get someone else inside of that business to do something, give them access to sensitive data, wire them money, maybe give them additional information for a subsequent and more advanced attack. It can also be represented as an impersonation of a trusted service. You have all probably seen something like this at some point, where you get what looks like a cloud-hosted file, that is a file that's sitting on a Dropbox account or a Google Drive account or a SharePoint account, and someone's asking you to open it up. It might be, as you can see on the bottom left, Microsoft itself is claiming that you need to go and log in to release messages that are being delayed or failed to be delivered. Of course, these aren't really messages from Microsoft or your executives. They are spearfishing attacks designed to harvest your credentials or get you to do something. I particularly like the one on the top right because we really received that. And Larita, who opened this webinar and did the introductions, got a message supposedly from me. I've been called many things in my career, but Earl Jordan 114 is not one of them. And this was a complete fraud, but it shows the kinds of attacks that people are relying upon. And so this door knock attack that this represents is indicative of someone trying to execute what presumably will be a more complex attack in the future using something like a lookalike domain like you see on the bottom right, where there's a DocuSign document that supposedly needs to be signed, but that U has an umlaut over it. Those two little dots are the difference between signing a sales contract and giving your credentials to an attacker. What do we do about this? As Tim pointed out, we can't rely exclusively on technology to solve this problem, and the traditional approach to thinking about spam, that is, consuming large amounts of data, and once you have that corpus of data, tuning a machine to look at it and figure out where the spam is and where the ham is, doesn't work on these low and slow attacks. And so as we alluded to earlier, there is a confluence of process, technology, and people investment that leading organizations are now bringing to bear on the spearfishing problem and on the email security problem writ large. So I want to speak briefly about that, and I think we need to understand first what we mean by these three things. Process is the formal written down set of rules you put in place around your business. When somebody says, I need you to respond to my email, or I need you to wire out money based on an outstanding account, or you have to go click on this link and release these messages, a process level control would say, we don't wire money without having verbal confirmation and a phone call. Or if you don't recognize the sender, you don't click on the link. This is good. Most organizations at scale have audit requirements that in fact require that their processes be aligned to certain standards and that they have to demonstrate on a typically annual basis that these are being communicated to staff. One of the challenges with that is that process doesn't always get followed. And so the second tier of the response framework that we propose is an investment in technology, but technology that doesn't attempt to solve the problem by blocking things, but rather to remind and arm the end user of what the process is and how they should behave. And I'm going to let Tim speak to that in more detail in just a moment, because contextualizing and thinking about technology and how it aligns to email is a major topic and one we're going to spend some time on both today and in the future. But the last leg of this stool is the people component. And obviously you've seen the examples we got where someone targets Larita or a member of a team and says, I need you to go and do something. There is a misunderstanding and a misconception amongst security professionals that, quote, humans are the weakest link. It's a really unfortunate way to try to use fear to sell software and technology. We think that a end user is your best opportunity to block or prevent an attack. And having strong alignment between process and people through the use of technology turns that supposedly weakest link into one of your strongest assets. Tim, do you want to put a little bit of color in here, maybe specifically to that defense in depth concept we were talking about?
Oh yeah. To the point here about this is more than just technology. There's a feeling of shared responsibility by talking about these things. When we're collaborating, we thought along these lines. We were trying to find a tidy way of how process and technology and people, how they interact at the levels of individuals, organizations, and across industries. Putting this together, we didn't feel that a matrix with rows and columns really captured the insight. The key was in the relationships as opposed to the traditional way of defense in depth applied to specific target areas. A better way to get there, though, I think, is for us to compare and contrast what people have been doing with what they've been given versus what is effective when approached from a broader perspective. That broader perspective being consider how industries are interoperating, consider what the organization's doing, and consider individuals that compose an organization. So looking at it across the entire perspective as opposed to defense in depth to shield people, to shield an organization, and to educate the general public. So I think that gets us to the first part, which is user engagement, which is the next slide.
One of the interesting things, Tim, about user engagement is that, as you just said, we have this thinking around defense in depth that it involves preventing people from being able to get access to data. It's a real misunderstanding and misappropriation of the term. So defense in depth is a concept that we first see emerging from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, largely out of academic research and then later into formal policy recommendations in the 90s and early 2000s. The idea is that defense in depth is a concept that you apply to a security program to ensure you don't have a single point of failure. The implementation, sadly, has been that we have an idea that users can't be trusted, so we will put as many levels of, quote, defense between them and doing their work as possible. If you look at users as the problem and you lock users out and you use technologies that were designed for an era when the primary problem that you would have from an email perspective is that you would get, quote, unwanted mail, spam, right? Then having a modality of security that said, just don't let the user see that stuff. Just put it in the junk folder. Just quarantine it and leave it up to the InfoSec team to figure out when something had broken business process really doesn't align. And I think when we look at the evolution of cloud infrastructure, the ability for users today to walk into a job with their personal tablet, phone, the ability to easily gain access to what would have been enterprise-grade email systems 10 or 15 years ago with nothing more than a 5-minute sign-up to get a Gmail account or a modern email account on the web somewhere really shifts the landscape. And blocking users just doesn't work. So, Tim, do you want to talk a little bit about the modern approach and a bit more about what we're seeing work today?
Well, yeah, I just have to first agree that from my perspective, isolating users just hasn't worked. There's a lot of guidance around training people to not click on, quote, bad things, but the companies that specialize in performing this kind of training, they're reporting that users are constantly failing to avoid the bad things. So that kind of approach, it's good in terms of being a training program, but it's not actually effective at preventing the sharpest kinds of email that come through and really damage things. So in my opinion, clearly people need better tools when going through their email. And so the modern approach there at the bottom of the slide there, we're starting to see a lot more functionality where users themselves are given better tools when processing email so that if they see something strange, they can get a lot better response. So it's not the model of pushing an email into a quarantine that eventually gets released by an expert, but rather the users themselves get enough visual signal to, I don't want to go as far as say perform their own investigation, but a lot of the sharp edges have been worn off by the technology part so that users are, there's less things for users to get hurt by.
It's a great segue into talking about where technology does have a role to play, of course. So I like the idea that we round off the sharp edges. Where I think technology in the modern approach does have some ability to help is in taking what are categorically bad emails out of mailboxes. And this is an area where having that good-bad binary classification view of the world works well. In the same way that it works well on an endpoint device, or it works well at a network firewall, some things, malware, file hash-based detection or static analysis of threat, malicious URLs that exist on multiple real-time blacklists, these kinds of things we can get rid of. And I think you have to acknowledge that security professionals aren't ill-informed. They're not stupid. These things work really well in all the other areas of security. But what doesn't work is to then take that idea of binary classification from a technological perspective and think that you can apply it to the problem that we're describing. Think to Tim's slide, looking at the one fish jumping out of the waves, that isolated, well-crafted, and dangerous attack message will bypass the kinds of things that would work if you were solving for volumetric malware distribution. And so the second thing we saw businesses start to do was say, all right, we know that we're not going to catch 100% of the bad stuff. Let's train our users. Training users has its own challenge to it. First, one of the things that's very difficult to do is impact end user behavior. People are resistant to change, regardless of whether we're talking about professionals in an office or somewhere else. And so telling people that they can't use email, remember, 47-year-old system, almost everyone has been using it for at least a decade or two. That's not going to work. And secondly, the kinds of things we're asking people to do don't match our infrastructure expectations as they exist in 2018. If you tell someone, hover your mouse cursor over a link that you think might be suspicious, you're asking them to, one, be a security expert and understand if that link's suspicious, and two, hover their mouse cursor. But what if they're on an iPad? What if they're in an airport? What if they're at home looking at their smartphone and it's 9 p.m. and they're checking their email before turning in for the night? What mouse cursor? So this idea that technology and training together will solve for the phishing problem is utterly erroneous. And it really leads to why this problem is so significant and large today. But there is a better way. Tim?
Yeah, I think just a side note, there, in the InfoSec community, there's the perception that users are the problem. And I agree to some extent that users are a problem. But treating people like static assets, I think, is not the most effective way to deal with users as a problem. People are not static assets. They, as to Kevin's point, they move around the world. They're essentially a dynamic relationship with the organization, and so you have to treat them like things that are going to move around the world. So the traditional way of surrounding a user with a layer of armor to prevent bad things from getting to them, we just have to recognize that people are going to be out there in the wild experiencing things they can't anticipate. So a better way would be to embed people into a process that could be tuned to reduce the risk. It's better to treat it as a combination as opposed to thinking that there's one technology solution that's going to solve everything.
But don't take.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tim. I'm sorry.
Oh no, you.
I say don't take our word for it. Look at that survey that we started the presentation with. If the idea that technology and training alone could solve for this problem was true, then you wouldn't find that 20% of the respondents from the InfoSec side were reporting that on a weekly basis they were taking remediation action. That is a high rate of failure when you consider that for a typical organization who might get, say, 100 million email messages over the course of a week, having a 20% failure rate where they have to go and take manual action on messages that are targeting their users, and every individual incident of a cybersecurity breach can cost tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's not an acceptable margin for error. And this idea that technology is sufficient has a role to play, perhaps, but we can't allow for that erroneous understanding of what worked for spam will work for phishing and targeted phishing to persist. Thankfully, though, there are some things we can do. Tim, why don't you talk about it from the industry perspective to start?
This is my favorite one. Thank you. This one is near and dear to my heart. Most organizations, they do not take advantage of technologies that are available right now that are used to build and maintain trust across the internet. I'm not talking about securing an online asset like a website using SSL certs or protecting a perimeter using firewalls or anything like that. There are significant efforts underway right now to get organizations to deploy technology that allow everyone else on the internet to reliably trust whatever is online that purports to be you. If email is any indication, getting organizations to adopt these technologies will take a long time, but it has to be done. The difference is interoperating on the open internet. It's not a product. It's basically a set of technology specifications, just like email is. So if you're a business and you're on the internet, you should figure out how to make it so that everybody else that's going to communicate with you can do so in a secure way. You can find companies. There are some products that you could pursue that'll help you deploy these technologies. But again, the technologies themselves are all about interoperability. And so using these technologies so that anybody on the open internet can actually tell that you are you really approaches the problem in a new way. And it's less of a defensive posture, and it's more like allowing yourself to be trusted on the internet. So don't let people guess, really make it so that you have an established and stable presence online. Kevin, I'm
I
not
think
sure
what,
if you want to. Yeah.
yeah, I do. I think what aligns to that is that from an information security perspective, and let's differentiate that there is an industry standard technology adoption problem that organizations can solve for by using some of these standards. You can also then take an InfoSec perspective and look at that same challenge and begin to determine whether your organization is in a good state or not with respect to that kind of standards adoption. Why does this matter? Take something like the examples of the impersonations of me that we saw a few moments ago. I made a joke about the fact that the email address was someone else's name. That's hard to tell as an end user. If Kevin O'Brien, spelled the way that I spell my name, sends an email to someone on my staff, and we haven't done the work of putting that kind of industry protection in place, that attacker can not only use the friendly name that you see when you look at mail on your phone, Kevin O'Brien, they can also use my domain name at greathorn.com. And that's a problem because now there is no way that my end user can differentiate between the real Kevin and the imposter. But if you do implement these standards, and they're not technologies, not things you buy, they're standards, you can't become anyone inside of that company in the literal same way as the real sender. And so you end up with it being someone's fake name. You end up with it being someone's Gmail address. And I think what's nice about taking that approach is that that opens the door to then move back down the stack from a spectrum perspective and think about how you can protect yourself using more than just one layer of defense. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, I can't get enough of this picture. We've gone over a lot in the webinar so far. When GreatHorn and dmarcian sat down and started collaborating, we went through a lot, generated a lot of material. I believe this is going to be part 1 of 3. This picture here, though, to summarize, there's 3 high-level categories to pay attention to: industry, organization, and the individual. Traditionally, these are viewed as silos, but in our experience, a more effective response to phishing requires looking at the space between these areas, that is the relationships between individuals and their organization and between organizations and their industries. The relationship part really matters. From an industry perspective, there are standards-based ways to interoperate on the internet so that you can make your organization as something that can be trusted. You don't have to guess at whether something is real or not, and you should go after all the technologies to interoperate correctly with the internet. As an organization, this is from an InfoSec perspective, an organization should do this first and foremost, make itself trustworthy on the internet. From the individual perspective, GreatHorn has been pioneering in terms of looking at the relationships between individuals and between individuals and their organization. And so looking at the entire spectrum of the problem space that phishing represents, this is the most concise kind of diagram that we've been able to create so far.
What I think is important here is that there's overlap between these. And part of the reason that Tim and I were mutually excited by the prospect of building a partnership between our organizations was because we solve different sides of this equation, but they have a section in the middle where they come together. Putting in place industry protection and then putting context in front of a user requires organizational commitment, and it's often organizational commitment from the same group of people. If you have responsibility for email, if you're thinking about information security, if you're protecting your business from advanced cyber threat that will be deployed against your executives related to where you are, the kinds of data you have, financing and information that's put out on the public internet, having an industry to individual response plan at the organizational level is the only way that you can protect yourself effectively. And I think it's a really good chance for us to begin to talk about what that looks like in practice. We will have subsequent webinars going in more detail around how a plan like that comes together. But so you know where we're coming from, Tim, do you want to say a few words about what you do? I'll talk about GreatHorn, and then we can maybe open it up for some questions.
Oh yeah, just real quick. dmarcian itself, it was created immediately after DMARC was made public, and its sole mission is to fold DMARC into the internet. And DMARC itself, just a technology, it's a building block, or rather a foundation upon which trust can be built across the internet. So it's one of those pieces of interoperability that allow you to send email that other people don't have to guess whether or not it's real or not. And our focus is squarely in that space between the organizations and their industries.
And conversely, GreatHorn is an email security provider. And what we do is help organizations that have adopted cloud email systems understand where the threats in their mailboxes are, and then through both automatic as well as instant response-driven policies, take action on them. Meaning that we can provide an end user with context about whether a given message is fraudulent or not, and we can help an information security team respond to those threats in seconds rather than hours or days.
Great. Thanks to both of you for both your time and the content that you've provided so far. I want to remind everybody that the questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel is available for questions. We do have a number that have come in already, so I'm going to get to them in just a second. But just as a reminder, we are going to be sending the recording and the slides available after the webinar via email. And both the CEOs have mentioned that we will be doing multiple webinars. So the next two are listed here. We're still finalizing the dates, but we'll certainly let you know. The intention being that the second webinar will have a tactical discussion of some of the philosophical discussions here. And then the third will be kind of an in-depth understanding of what the two companies do. With regard to the questions, the first one here is, how do you guys feel about running phishing campaigns on your own employees to raise awareness?
Sure, I'll take a first crack at that, and then Tim, if you want to add some color to it. There's two reasons why you would do something like that. The first is that a phishing campaign run against your own employees can give you a benchmark about where you are. Benchmarking is a good practice, and knowing what you're trying to change and understanding what the metrics are that you're trying to move look like gives you at least a baseline for knowing where you are at. What doesn't make sense is to think that there is a correlation between phishing your own employees and solving the fact that they are going to fall for it to a degree that's going to be concerning to you when you see the results. And unfortunately, budgets are limited, time is finite, and we see information security teams sometimes think that they can just keep phishing our employees and do it often enough that we push content to them, we make them watch a video every time they click on a link, and now dust the hands off, we're done, we've solved the problem. Doesn't work. Stats show that within 6 months of your most recent phishing simulation, your numbers go back to what the baseline was. You have employee drift where people change roles, and worse, you end up having a security team that believes it has taken effective action against the phishing problem, but in reality, it's either driven it underground or created a business side resentment of the security team for making them look foolish. So good technique for understanding where you start, but it's just a starting point and not a stopping point. Anything you'd add to that, Tim?
Yeah, I think in my personal opinion, I think it's a great way to raise awareness across an organization that there's a problem. A lot of folks, especially if they're not in the tech industry, they might not know that their email clients aren't doing anything to protect them from fraud. And just the shocking amount of very dangerous and sharp things that end up in people's inboxes. Most non-infosec or non-email people that I speak with, they just assume that the mailbox provider or the IT staff or whomever is doing the job of making things safe. So if they go in their inbox and they start clicking links, the assumption is, there's been a car launched into space. We've landed people on the moon. We've got satellites orbiting the Earth. Like, how come there's something I can do with my personal computer that can actually harm someone, right? You're just pushing on buttons. And so a lot of people just have no awareness that, in fact, the email space is quite dangerous for end users. So I think as a way to raise awareness, it's definitely useful. It doesn't exactly solve the problem, but it might raise awareness. It might justify taking future action. So it's kind of like a InfoSec business case builder, if you will.
Great, thank you. The next question, one of our customers recently got phished by someone pretending to be us. How would we prevent that?
Tim, why don't
Oh,
you
that
take the
one's
first pass of that?
yeah. Well, if let me make sure I understood the question correctly. Someone sent an email to a customer that was pretending to be you. What you should do is make it very easy to for your email to be identifiable. There's technologies like DMARC that you can use. It's invented to make email easy to identify. That would probably be the first step that I would recommend. However, there are more robust things that you could do, so you don't have to rely upon the person to send you an email to do the right thing. And I think, Kevin, you could probably talk to that.
One of the things we see when this kind of an attack happens is typically that an organization either hasn't done something like implement DMARC and all of the things that go into email authentication writ large, or that they've only done a partial job of it. And when I look at, say, a Fortune 500 company whom we work with, and they have nearly 1,000 domains that are affiliated with their brand, and developers on their engineering teams are creating new services and new instances of machines that can send mail as them. They've done a great job shoring up their fundamental email infrastructure, but then monitoring that in an ongoing way and thinking about where new opportunities for threat might emerge given the normal operational cadence of the business. That's a daunting task if you're trying to do it manually. Having an approach that lets you pull all of the mail that's going through your system and think about protecting against a potential security vulnerability being created is the second half of the equation there. And if you're doing both those things together, which legacy approaches don't do, by the way, if you're just taking a quarantine the bad stuff model, you're thinking about bad things coming to your users, you don't have visibility into what Tim's talking about. What do we look like to the outside world? You can measure that. There are technologies and processes that you can put in place that will help you get your hands around that problem. And if you do that, you're far less likely to be the company that is impersonated to your customers, meaning you don't have those emails going out to the market.
Thank you. The next question, I think, is principally for Kevin. There's a question scenario: full reject with DMARC in place already. G Suite is the email backend, but most of the users prefer Outlook for viewing and using email. They don't use the Gmail web client. So does the approach of supplying additional context to users for suspicious emails work in this hybrid situation?
The answer is that you can make it work. You can't do it with just what the platform provider, in this case Google, gives you. So huge gap there, right? And it's one that's non-obvious unless you've encountered the situation that the question asker has brought up. Google, if you use Google either for your personal email or you use it at work, has a pretty robust set of anti-spam filters. And they've started to extend some alerting based on basic content analytics to say, hey, this message talks about financial information. It might be fraudulent. Make sure you know the sender. That's great if you're in front of Chrome and logged into Google. And if you've got a user base, like many organizations, that's on Outlook, suddenly you're not getting that level of protection. It is possible, and this is something specific to GreatHorn, but there are a variety of ways that you can do this to drive that context into the message itself and not have it be something you have to rely upon the platform provider to do for you. And if you do undertake a process like that, in the same way that you've already gotten yourself to a full reject policy on DMARC, so you've taken preventative steps around your brand being impersonated, you can also now take preventative steps around somebody targeting your users and getting around the protections that in theory are coming from your provider. And you can do that agnostic with respect to what the end user experience is, an iPhone, an iPad, Outlook, or a browser looking at webmail.
Thanks, Kevin. This next question is for both of you. I'm going to start with Tim, and then Kevin, you can follow up with any additional thoughts. If an organization does not have a current user training program or technology to detect phishing attacks, how would you begin? What would be the first priority?
Oh, that's a good question. So let me rephrase the question, and Loretta, maybe you can help me make sure I got it right. No training program in place yet. And so how do you get to the first part about raising awareness? So maybe to color the background a little bit, InfoSec professional at a company, have no budget, beating the drum, but no one's listening. Is that, Loretta, is that a fair take?
Yeah, I think what it sounds like is if you're starting from ground zero and you don't have either training or technology in place, you know, so you want to tackle the phishing threat, what's the first thing that you start with? How do you start the process?
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I think visibility is the first thing. You have to in order to raise awareness, you have to have something to look at and report on. You can use DMARC to start collecting data for free. That'll tell you how people are using your domains across the open internet. Oftentimes, InfoSec professionals could use that as a starting point. You can collect data, you can process it, you can present it to other people to show them that there is an issue, that there are people out there on the open internet that are pretending to be your own organization. Normally, that's enough to get the first conversation kicked off, but there are other techniques for collecting such information. You can also look at your own email servers, try to figure out how much spam is being blocked. You can use that as just an easy metric to tell managers and colleagues that, hey, there is a real issue out there on the open internet. Those are some very basic things that you could do with very little help from anyone else. InfoSec professionals could get started to build visibility doing that.
I think the other thing you can start to look at there is when you have a user base and you're receiving messages that are dangerous or potential phish, and you don't have a program in place around training, how do you build awareness? Well, we've talked a lot about context, right? So an InfoSec team doesn't need to get budget to write good policy and to say that we're going to have a set of processes around how we handle wire transfers, how we're going to handle requests for sensitive information, and how we want users to respond to potentially dangerous senders, especially those who might be impersonating either core executives in the business, as is often the case with a spearfishing attack, or business services that the company uses. You can put that kind of policy in place and then put context in front of the user. This is very different from what you'll see with a traditional email security approach, where you have to go buy a technology, change your mail routing to push all your mail through them, start teaching users how to interact with the quarantine. That's a heavy lift. Telling them, hey, you just got a message from someone whom you've never received mail from before. It's asking about wire content, and it's using the display name of somebody inside the business. And it might be a threat because it could be an impersonation attack. And by the way, here's the policy that we have in place when that happens. Those kinds of things are great starting points, and in some ways more effective than trying to start by having a general conversation about phishing to a user base that may not yet understand what that means, because they haven't been told that email you just got, that's what we're talking about when we talk about being careful around email security.
Great, thank you. And we're coming up at the top of the hour, so I'm just going to bring in one other question. For anybody else that has questions, please feel free to go ahead and continue to submit them. We'll answer any questions that we didn't have time to answer personally via email. This one's really, I think, more for you, Tim. It's how is DMARC different than something like DKIM?
DMARC itself is an overlay on top of DKIM. DKIM is a technology that allows someone to essentially attach a domain to a piece of email, and that attachment travels with the message in the form of a DKIM signature. DMARC is very different. It's more of like a framework that DKIM can plug into so that DKIM itself becomes more useful. DMARC is an overlay. It gives you feedback if you're the domain owner, so you can actually see how your domain is being used across the internet. When you go through the process of telling the world that you're doing the work of making your email easy to identify, you use DKIM and use another technology called SPF to get that actual link between an email and a domain done. DMARC itself is just it's more like it's an overlay that gives you feedback, and it also provides the policy mechanism. The policy mechanism part of DMARC allows you to tell the world, hey, we've gone through all the work. All of our legitimate email can be identified using either SPF or DKIM. And once you do that, you can then throw a switch that tell the world, hey, we've done all the work. If you get something that purports to be from us, but it's not compliant with DMARC, feel free to drop it outright. And so they're different technologies, but they build upon each other.
Great, thank you, Tim. So as I mentioned, we're a little bit over the 45 minutes that I promised at the top of the hour, but hopefully the additional questions that we were able to answer were useful for everybody's time. I want to thank you all again for taking the time to listen to Tim and Kevin as they walked you through the evolution of phishing, and really encourage you to keep an eye out for these next two webinars. As I said, the next one, a how-to guide for modernizing your phishing defenses, will be more tactical in nature, a little bit more prescriptive, and then the third one we'll talk about we'll talk about both companies. In the meantime, keep an eye out also for our follow-up email that will have a link to the slides and the webinar recording. And feel free to reach out to either company if you have any additional questions. We'll be happy to answer them. Thanks again for your time, and to Tim and Kevin for your time as well as the content. And I hope that everybody has a great day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.